Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria and welcome to the first of two Best of 2013 editions of Counting the Cost, as we look back on some of the highlights of our show this year. And it has been a very busy year. We moved into this studio back in January, but no sooner were we settled in and Counting the Cost had hit the road. From the desert here in Doha all the way up to the alpine resort of Davos in Switzerland for the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Now, it was our first trip there and we marked it with a special debate program featuring a star panel of world leaders and economic minds. The debate was called The Economic Malaise and Its Perils. Our big focus was unemployment.
55% youth unemployment in Spain, 26% unemployment across the board there. It just keeps getting worse, and the thing which worries me when I look at this, and I'm sure it worries a lot of people, is that there doesn't seem to be a bend in the road there. You can't see when this could possibly get better. Your initial thoughts on just how bad this unemployment crisis is?
Well, I think in the case of Spain, you've hit the nail on the head. The figures that came out this week are absolutely appalling. And you're quite right to say that there's no apparent turn in the road. You can't see the upturn. But I think whilst we're all focused, and understandably so, on Spain right now, we lost over 4 million jobs, 4 million more unemployed in 2012. For 2013, it's another 5 million, and it carries on. The horizon is not in sight. So I think policymakers need to take very, very quick action, full advantage of the space that perhaps financial improvement offers us to tackle the jobs crisis.
Well, I hate to state the obvious here, but it's all self-perpetuating here. If you haven't got a job, or if there aren't jobs, the economy can't grow. And if the economy can't grow, it can't create jobs. And if jobs, and it goes on and on and on. Again, I go back to my point here that the desperation of people, if we bring it back to people every time, they can't see an end to this. Yeah.
Well, that simple logic that you've set out was a logic that wasn't apparent to policymakers when we started applying austerity in Europe to tackle the financial crisis. If you'd have said that or been listened to 3 or 4 years ago, perhaps we might have been able to avoid some of the excesses of the job crisis right now, which, as you're indicating, is perhaps a definition. It's not the only element of the economic malaise that we face, but it's absolutely the quintessential centre of it all. Prime
Minister, I feel we could spend the whole time talking about Europe if we're not careful. I would like to quickly get to Asia and actually tell me how bad or in fact how good it is there in comparison.
Well, if there is one area, Kamal, which is a ray of hope, that's basically ASEAN and East Asia. If you go there, there's an air of optimism. People believe that things are actually getting better. In the case of Malaysia, we are at the heart of ASEAN. And there's full employment in Malaysia. 3.1% unemployment, which is considered full employment.
What do you do differently there?
I think we realized that, coming out of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, we recovered. We were growing, but we were growing slowly, at 3-4%. And we were in the so-called middle income trap. We needed to have a breakout strategy. So we came up with a new economic model. And that was the key to it. A planned transformation in a very comprehensive way. And that created a huge jump in private investment. And that's really the engine of growth. And when you talk about creating jobs, it's really revitalizing the private sector, because the private sector will provide jobs. And as a result, we've created more than 300,000 new jobs in just a few years. So things are looking up, and we've proven that you can actually do it.
Mr. President, I wonder if I could bring you in here. I did a little bit of research and looked at some unemployment numbers for Iceland. End of 2008, you had around 1% unemployment, and then when things got bad, it got really bad, and it got really bad really fast. We're talking 8% unemployment in a matter of months, 6 months perhaps. As a leader, tell me and tell our audience how you confront that. Because this is what other countries in Europe and around the world are looking at. They're looking at this number and they're thinking, how on earth do I deal with that?
I think the most important aspect of our solution after the crisis was that we were fortunate enough to realize that this was not just an economic crisis. This was a profound social and democratic crisis. It was more about people than about banks. And I think the big problem with the European debate today is it has been framed in such a way that it's primarily about financial markets rather than about people. So we let the banks fail. We didn't bail them out. We devalued the currency. We introduced currency controls. We went against the established orthodoxies of the prevailing IMF-led Western policymaking, which was attempt to force on Asia more than 20 years ago. And I think it should be a wake-up call for everybody in those financial institutions that Iceland now, 4 years later, as we were at the beginning of the crisis, exhibit number one in terms of a failed country, we are now exhibit number one in terms of recovery and success. Because we went against the policy ideology which puts banks and financial markets up front and treats people and unemployment somewhat as a secondary priority. Now, I've often said, why are banks treated as the holy churches of the modern economy? What's the difference between a telecommunication company and a bank in terms of providing social well-being and healthcare?
Turkey, and I'm making a horrible generalization here, but it's not a country we hear about much in the economic crisis. We were discussing before the panel how you're bridged between Europe and Middle East and dealing with so many different things. How have your policies there impacted? How have they kept things in check in Turkey or otherwise?
Well, for every stage of the crisis since 2007, 2008, what we have done in Turkey is putting confidence at the center of our policies. Whatever is needed to secure confidence with our consumers, with our corporates, and with our financial sector, we have done that. But growth came from private sector activity, private consumption, private investments. Government spending, in our case, had no contribution to our growth. This high growth, together with targeted labor market policies, helped us also to generate jobs. What we have done, for example, was for those who lost their jobs for the last 6 months, we reduced the cost of entry for them to get back to the job market. We simply, as the Treasury, paid the Social Security premium for those who have been unemployed for the last 6 months, if they got a job. For young people up to age 29, and also for women, if they were getting into the job market for the very first time, we again paid the Social Security as the Treasury, so that the employer didn't have to bear the costs. We started vocational training programs. Hundreds of thousands of young people got into those programs. And for every day that they joined the program, we paid them about $10 or so that they can cover the cost of transport and lunch and so forth. For vocational training...
So that's good. So I'll interrupt you there just quickly. That to me sounds like the kind of practical thing. Like, exactly. Because a young person might go, I can't afford to catch the bus, or I can't, those are the things which mount up. Those are the types of, when we talk about policy, an actual practical thing which the person can see. They're not just hearing a politician talk about it.
Exactly. And also for example, for practical training, if a young guy got a job, for the practical training period in a factory, we paid the salary for the first 6 to 9 months. So that employer and employee gets to know each other, and if the employer likes him or her, they can continue.
Yeah, it was a great experience being able to chat to so many strong economic minds in the one place, and to hear so many good ideas too. Now, when we get such voices on our program, we do try to bring them back regularly, and Stephen King is one such voice. Stephen is the chief economist for HSBC, but back in May he joined us not so much as an economist but as an author. His book was rather ominously titled, When the Money Runs Out. You said in the book, for my children's sake, I can only hope that the recommendations at the end of this book are heeded. That's some pretty serious talk, a whole generational thing.
No, that's absolutely right. The problem in one sense is that over the last few years, the baby boomers, and I'm at the very end really of that generation of baby boomers, have done very, very well. They've managed to grab lots and lots of resources, but at the same time have built up huge amounts of debt. But over the last 10 years or so, Western economies have mostly stalled. The UK, the US, Europe have delivered growth rates much, much lower than we've been seeing in the past. And the problem with those very low growth rates, of course, is it means that all those debts we thought we could pay off as a consequence of continuous increases in income are much more difficult to deal with now.
OK, Stephen, let's take the economist's hat off for a moment and put the author's hat on, because I am keen to get some thoughts from you on what it's actually, like writing this book, writing a book which is, if I'm honest, economically apocalyptic. What was it like?
Well, it's not that bad. I mean, I do have some suggestions at the end of the book as to how to try and deal with some of these difficulties. It's a great learning experience. You have to read a huge amount of academic papers and books and so on to effectively educate yourself. And in particular, I was very interested in some of the historical lessons which might play a role in where we are today. So I went as far back as the Peasants' Revolt in the UK in 1381, to the French Revolution, and so on and so forth, all as examples of where economic growth disappointed. And of course, when you're off work, you can spend more time with your family as well, which is also a real pleasure.
And has anyone come to you since the book's been written, anyone, policymakers or bankers or anyone up there, and sort of said to you, Stephen King, you're right here, we like what you're saying, and some of your ideas, we should actually look at even implementing them?
I think there's a great deal of sympathy for some of the issues contained within the book, particularly this idea that we're facing a lower growth rate, and we've made claims on future income that can't be met, and that somehow those claims have to be reduced. And I think the problem we have at the moment is that most politicians and policymakers, in public at least, if not in private, are still engaged in a dramatic degree of wishful thinking. They like to portray that they can easily generate a decent recovery. But I think in the back of their minds, they're very well aware that actually what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years has been actually quite disappointing. To be fair, the good news is that we did avoid a Great Depression, which was genuinely threatened back in 2008, 2009. But the problem is that the recovery that's come through subsequently is far weaker than any policymakers had suggested or indeed expected. And I don't think they've quite come to terms with the fact that income levels are so much lower than was originally thought.
One of the big stories of 2013 was privacy, online privacy, in the wake of the now infamous revelations by Edward Snowden. He told the world all about Operation Prism, how the US government was collecting phone, email and social network information from, well, basically anyone. And it touched off a huge debate about data safety and what our personal information is worth. Our research on that story led us to San Francisco and the company Mozilla, which produces the Firefox web browser, and a little add-on called Collusion. Have a look at this. So let's say you went to the website IMDb, Internet Movie Database. These 3 behavioural tracking sites, things like doubleclick.net, they come up, they're tracking what you're doing. Then we add another website into it here. We've got the New York Times coming in, and as you'll see, it pops out a couple more tracking sites. But the key is that they start joining up with the original ones. So there's IMR Worldwide, but doubleclick.net is now with both of them. Add another one in again. We've got the Huffington Post here, a big media website here, and again the web starts to spread. AOL.com, the blue one on the right-hand side, that's now in there as well, and these are all linking up. All of these tracking sites are now tracking you across all of these different sites. And then, as you see, we can throw a couple more in with GameSpot.com. There's also Reference.com, and the whole thing starts to go a little bit crazy, this whole web of online tracking.
From a Mozilla perspective, I think it's important for your viewers to understand that Mozilla is a nonprofit organization. So essentially everything that we're doing as part of our development of Firefox is really intended to be in the user's best interest.
Right, so then this is how I guess you can stay out of all the controversy which comes up from something like Operation Prism. And you've got this other movement as well, a website which is called stopwatching.us. Now tell me about how that is going, because that's been quite a recent development.
In particular, what we're really focused on through this campaign is getting users of the internet to understand the implications of massive online surveillance in the systems that they use every day, and getting them engaged in the public dialogue about whether this is the right balance between national security interests and personal privacy protections.
And what is your view when you talk about the dialogue? Are you saying, as the website explicitly says, stop watching us entirely? Or are you saying be transparent about it so that we can make our own informed decisions about privacy?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's important to point out that across the public we have a broad spectrum of values as it relates to personal privacy. So I think we're starting the campaign with the focus on dialogue, with the focus on transparency. Ultimately, we want citizens to engage in the discussions with our policymakers, not just here in the US, but with governments around the world, about how to set the balance appropriately. But I think to the core component of your question, we do think that there is importance of protecting national security, but we just think it's more important that the methods of how we do that work be transparent and public and well understood by the public as a matter of policy.
What do you think of your competitors and the other tech companies out there who've been implicated in all of this, and if, the leaks are to be believed, are providing this backdoor access for the NSA to get their hands on people's data?
It's important to understand, right, that these are the laws of the land. They're responding to properly authorized court orders to provide information. So in a sense, they're in a very difficult position. And then they're also told not to say anything about this to anyone, to their users, to the public. So I mean, they are to a certain extent in a very difficult position, and so we recognize that, and I think that's why when you look at the underlying business models, right, of all of these companies, Mozilla included, information is increasingly the driver for how our businesses operate. So these types of secret, invasive government surveillance requests go to the very heart of the relationships that we have with our users. So again, like if it's not transparent, if people don't understand how it works, what the implications of that are, then it makes it very difficult for people to trust that these service providers are going to be accountable at the end of the day.
If it's at all possible, I like to get out of the studio and film some pieces here in our own backyard. Now, for some crazy reason, I thought that filming in the Qatari desert in the middle of July was a good idea. For the record, it wasn't. It was ridiculously hot. But we were looking at the idea of whether hosting big sporting events is really worth it, remembering the World Cup is due to come here to Qatar in 2022. If all goes according to plan, this will be what people talk about when they talk about the 2022 World Cup and its legacy. For starters, this is where the main stadium will be. They're building an 80,000-seat venue called the Lusail Iconic Stadium. It'll be, as these venues tend to be, the centerpiece of the whole World Cup. It's actually a brand new city because that's what will be built around the iconic stadium, something called Lusail City. It's this whole area out here. We're talking 35 square kilometers, and they say by the end of it all, 200,000 inhabitants, 170,000 employees, 22 hotels, 4 man-made islands thrown in as well. Now, if you're talking legacy, then a brand new city built from scratch for a growing country is a pretty good one. But the question that always has to be asked in this part of the world is the one about supply and demand. Quite simply, will there be enough demand to fill all this supply? Now, there's already a lot of empty real estate across Doha these days, and there's a lot of big infrastructure projects which are still to come online or are maybe just in their infancy. Now, yes, the population is growing, but it's still only around 2 million, and a large proportion of that is the migrant labour and expat population who are actually building places like this. Now, they're not the population who'll be filling a Lusail City of the future. The big advantage that Qatar will have with this tournament is that so much of the infrastructure which you need for a tournament like this doesn't even exist. They're starting with a clean slate. This road, for example, brand new but temporary, whilst we wait for the Lusail Expressway, a 3-level expressway to be built. Well, Stefan Zamansky's an expert in sports economics, and he's joining us via Skype from Michigan in the United States, and we thank you for your time, Stefan. Our central question in this segment is it worth it? Now, I know there are so many variables to think about, but for the amount a country can spend in hosting a big sports event, is it really worth it for what you get back?
Well, I think it's a bit like thinking about your family and thinking about whether it's worth going on that holiday or worth going to the theatre or the cinema. And really, it's one of those subjective things. It's worth it if you enjoy it. And the key point here is to focus on that this is about consumption. It's not about investment and getting rich. You don't have these entertainments because you're going to make money. You have these entertainments because you enjoy them.
Is there something to be said for hosting in a country which needs these things put in place? You know, public transport, good roads, they're lacking here. At least these will be a real tangible benefit when the World Cup is over.
I think the problem with this is that actually the cost of building such things around the Olympics usually ends up being, you know, something like double what it would cost you if you didn't have the Games or the World Cup. And of course, in Qatar's case, I mean, I think the real question is, you know, the value of building these huge stadiums, which well, if they're going to be temporary structures, it's a huge expense. So whether in global terms, whether it meets a standard of cost-benefit analysis might be questionable. But I think the fundamental point is that Qatar, as an oil-rich state with a small population, can easily afford it. So, as I say, if you think it's worthwhile spending the money on consumption, then fair enough, it's worthwhile doing that.
And that was something I discussed earlier in the year with a prominent Qatari businessman, Issa Abdul Salam Abu Issa. He is the current custodian of the Salam Empire, which our Gulf viewers will probably have heard of. Here he shares some views on what the World Cup can bring to this region if it's done right. How do you fit into that? What can you bring to it? Because everyone, the businesses that exist here, the businesses that are growing here, they're going to have to contribute in some way because it is such a huge event. It's not just about building stadiums and hotels and things like that. What can you contribute? What can you get out of such a big event?
First of all, what I would like to say about that, I think this was a fantastic gift from His Highness the Emir and the people and the team who worked with him to acquire the 2022 Games. I'm not saying that to flatter, but at least for the first time we have a target date. And we are not used in our part of the world to have a target date. And this is the number one gift.
It forces people, they can't move that.
Yes, they cannot move that. They have to deliver what they have promised. Okay, so this is where the really big responsibility lies on the shoulders of the planners and the shoulders of the business people like ours. You know,
I'm making confident.
I sound confident, but I sound very happy also, because that is really something we lacked all our life during our career and our part of the world in general.
So how do you stay true to that, to what your father started here? Because from what I've read, he was a humble man, he was a self-made man. What we see around us now, the building we're sitting in right now, unrecognizable, it's a completely different world. How do you stay true to what he did?
To stay true is really to bring up our third generation to really carry the flag. And one of the important things and one of the major challenges that you should always keep in mind, how to bring up your children. Definitely at least in our generation, we have seen it, we have heard it from the first generation. We have to bring them up in a proper way, in a humble way, in a way full of respect to the people, full respect to the achievers. Very important that we recognize other achievers in our life and teach them and let them know that your achievement is one thing and other people's achievements is another thing, and this is the best way to integrate with the society.
I suspect people might think that doing business in the Gulf is easy just because there's a lot of money around, and that growing your business shouldn't be a problem because, as you say, there's construction everywhere. I'm not so sure that's the case.
It's not. It's not the case. It is as good as it is as difficult. You know, to conduct business here. You have so many challenges that you have to overcome. The limitations of the market, the limitations of the regulations in general. I mean, here we are overall in a big market, but segmented, and you know, lots of borders between the countries, and due to lack of unification of commercial laws and so on. So the challenges are there, and you really have to be creative all the time.
Issa Abdul Salam Abu Issa there, rounding out the first of our Best of 2013 shows. Remember, all our programmes online at aljazeera.com if you do want to revisit any of them. We'll be back next week too, though, with more of the best of Counting the Cost from 2013. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.